What effect does it have on God when we project love at God?
An amazing effect on God, of course. Like, what effect does it have on you when somebody loves you?
That's a varied response.
It's a varied response. Depends whether you wanted their love in the first place. Well, let's assume God wants your love.
Yeah.
So what do you feel God would feel then?
It would be lovely.
You see, one thing that a lot of people on earth don't understand, and a lot of people in the spirit world don't grasp either, is this. God has given you the ability to not give something to God, right? Because God gave you free will. God gave you your own will to exercise how you see fit. Under those circumstances, you can see that God gave you the ability to not love God. In fact, the only thing that you can give God that God isn't able to take from you is your love, if you think about it. Your will, your love, your will to love God. Now, if you imagine that for a moment, from God's perspective, you've created billions and billions and billions of children. And in your love for them, you've given them all the ability to not love you. And in fact, a lot of them don't. Right? What do you think you would feel when somebody decided to love you for the first time?
Yeah, well, it would be great.
Wouldn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah. It'd be something you've been longing for all of their existence, longing that they'd come to terms with it themselves, that they'd actually desire it from within their own heart. And then all of a sudden they desire it within their own heart for some reason, and away they go, and all of a sudden they start wanting to love you. You can feel the emotion that would be present, yes? It'd be just you imagine as a parent having a child, and then the child's 100 years old or 200 years old, 500 years old, 1,000 years old, still doesn't love you. And then all of a sudden the child decides to love you. How much of an effect that would have on the parent. That's the effect we have on God when we love God. It's the same effect, right? And when we first engage this desire to love God, and we first engage it, it's like you can imagine God in the up there, wherever God exists, beyond those universes that we've been talking about, just leaping for joy in her heart as a result of just one of God's, pinnacle of creation, God's children, one of God's children deciding to love God for the first time. And then how would you feel once that love became permanent? That would be such an incredible time, wouldn't it? It's a bit like, when you first discover somebody in a relationship, initially there's, I'm a bit interested. And that's a nice feeling, having someone a bit interested. Well, for most of us on the planet who have some form of a connection with God, we're really just still a bit interested. We're not really yet in the state where we're permanently interested in this relationship with God, and in fact have that as our very first relationship, right? When we go through this process of becoming permanently interested in God, and in fact putting that as our very first thing in our lives, the very first thing that guides our entire existence, that's another milestone in our relationship with God. Then another milestone in our relationship with God is once we get to the point where we're permanently connected with love. Like God can give love any time she wants, and we are ready to receive it. And we desire that love all the time, all the time. That would be another milestone, wouldn't it, in the relationship, just like it would be in a normal relationship. So you can see that there are milestones in our relationship with God. When the person who's had no interest in God at all first demonstrates some interest, like you did 4 years ago, God's heart leapt, yes? And God felt that and feels that as an emotion of joy. But Lily still doesn't want God all the time, right? So God's waiting for that milestone to be reached. Once that milestone's reached, now there's a real development in the relationship, yes? And then once Lily reaches the point of having a permanent connection in the sense of wanting God's love all the time and being able to receive it at any time and there being no impediments to the reception of that love, that'll be another milestone in the relationship. And every single one of those milestones God has a different response to, just like you would if you had a relationship with somebody else. It's like when you first meet somebody you're interested in, you're slightly interested, right? And then you feel drawn, but you're still working, you still got other friends, you still visit other people and whatever else. But then after a while you get really interested in this person, and you get to the point where you're so interested in the person that person becomes your highest priority. Then the second milestone is reached. Now you want to work on the relationship between you and that person constantly. You don't want to get distracted by lots of other things all the time. You're trying to focus more and more on that relationship. And so now your relationship has the potential to grow even more rapidly. Now imagine once you get to the point where both of you feel completely connected to each other permanently. Now that is not yet occurred on earth for any relationship, right? But imagine if it had.
Oh, okay. You and God in the first century.
Me and God, but not in my relationship with Mary or my soulmate. That didn't happen in the first century because we were in different conditions. For that to happen, both the partners have to be at one with God for that to actually occur. Now, you imagine in the development of your relationship those three milestones. Well, that's the same three milestones, if you think of it, as what's available in God. But then there's a fourth milestone with our relationship with God, that the other half of me merges with me while we're merged with God. So there's another milestone in the relationship. And I don't know beyond that how many more milestones in our relationship we possibly could have, but I'm assuming in an infinite relationship there's a potential of even more milestones, right? But even if you look at those four milestones, every single one of those milestones has an effect on God's heart, has an effect on God's feelings for us and also about us. And it's very, very different from God just observing our life. So before you met God, and I'd say the first time you longed for God was the time you met God, right? Before you met God, God was just sort of observing your life. God was attempting, through all of the things that you were experiencing, to help you recognise that you could have a connection with God. And God was trying to have some form of connection with you by doing a lot of external things to your life. But you imagine the very first time you went, and I can have a personal relationship with God, imagine how much of an effect that would have on God. It's the same as you observing someone you love and them not knowing you exist. And then all of a sudden, they notice you. How would you feel? Yeah, and that's the same feeling God has. That God all of a sudden feels this feeling of, wow, this person now wants to have a relationship with me, which is different than me just observing her. Now I can be more personally involved in her life. Now I can have a relationship. Before it was just like I've given her all these things and everything, but no relationship. I can just watch her up until then. And I can affect her life through external events, but I can't really do anything more with the personal relationship. And then all of a sudden there's this personal relationship. Imagine the effect that would have on God. Yeah, and it does have a very, very powerful effect on God. Every single individual who decides for the very first time to connect to God has a very big effect on God. And I feel in a lot of ways the love that we have, although it may in comparison to God be very small, the love that we have is something that does not belong to God. It only belongs to God when we give it. Yes? And you think about it, if I love God and you love God and then others start to love God, then of course God's going to feel more than when God was just observing. Yeah? Just like if I love you and then somebody else loves you and then somebody else loves you, and then all these people start loving you, you will feel different than when nobody loved you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's exactly the same.